Hello everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to another instalment in our lunchtime webinar series in association with AURPO. Today we've got something a little bit different. It's a members only exclusive Q&A session with Vicky Leslie about her film, The Atom, The Love Affair, which hopefully you've all watched. So very quickly, we'll just run through the ground rules before we start. So we will be recording this and uploading this to our YouTube channel afterwards. You can ask questions as normal through the Q&A box. There'll be first an introductory presentation by the director, and then we'll jump into the Q&A session. So if you pop those questions into the Q&A box, we'll do the same as we do in the previous webinars, where if you like the ones that you want answering as well, then we'll answer the most liked first. You can also get your CPD points claimed. So if you email the code to Georgie this time to register attendance, we'll pop that into the chat box, so you can get that from there later. And as always, please send us your feedback afterwards. We just want to know how we can do better, any ideas for anything in the future that you want to see, things like that. We'll be sent an online survey link for that after the webinar. Just one final plug for the 7th European ERPA Congress that's coming in June 2026. It'll be the first time that it's come to the UK, so we're all really excited about that, and it will be our SRP conference for that year, so put those dates in your diary. So I'd like to introduce Vicky Leslie, the director of the film that we're going to talk about today. She's a Brighton-based documentary filmmaker whose career spans almost 25 years. During that time, she's developed and produced top-rated and award-winning TV documentaries for broadcasters in the UK and North America, including for the BBC, Channel 4, Channel 5, History Channel, Discovery and National Geographic, as well as directing several independent short films which screen at festivals around the world and online. The Atom, A Love Affair is her debut feature documentary as a director, while our most recent film as producer, The Nettle Dress, was released in September last year and has enjoyed a sellout cinema run across the UK. So over to you, Vicky.
Good, right. So Charlene asked me to pull together a bit of a kind of overview of the intro to the film. So as you'll see from this opening slide, it was quite a long journey to make this film. So I've tried to sort of do a little bit of a potted history of how I ended up with the film that you guys have hopefully all just watched. The Atom, Love Affair, over 10 years in the making. I mean, with each year that goes by, it seems to get longer and longer. But it started in 2006. So back in 2006, if you can cast your minds back that far, I was working in TV then. I was doing sort of popular factual TV. It's kind of interesting now. There's a bit of a sort of re-evaluation of that time, I think, of the media. But I mean, at the time, I felt I was working on some things that were quite ethically dubious and quite sort of, it was, I don't know, I felt a bit uncomfortable about some of the things I was making. And I thought maybe I could just go off and do something by myself that felt a bit more kind of worthwhile. And it's kind of strange looking back to that time, because I've ended up spending the next, well over a decade, I mean, in a way, coming close to 2 decades by now, immersed in this world of nuclear power. But it was very much random that I picked this topic, really. It was literally it was in the news at the time. It was around the time that the Blair government was having this sort of look again at nuclear, of whether it needed to be in the power mix really for climate change. I was a sort of Greenpeace campaigner doing street stalls about like marine reserves and rainforests and things like that. So I had an interest in kind of environmental topics. I didn't honestly know a huge amount about nuclear power. I was at primary school when Chernobyl happened, so I did kind of have a vague memory of that. But probably if I look back, I'm not even really sure I knew that nuclear was kind of still a thing. And so I thought, oh, well, maybe I can make a film that will contribute to this debate, which I look back at that, I kind of laugh at my younger self about how naive I was about how easy this endeavour was going to be. But anyway, I thought, right, I'm going to make a feature film about nuclear energy. And the first thing I did, I was basically doing like proto crowdfunding before that was even really a thing or a term. And I emailed like everybody in my contacts. My company is called Tenor Films, and that came from this initial idea. I just contacted everybody that I knew, and I said, I'm going to make a film about nuclear power, and if 10,000 people can give me £10, then I can make this film. There was a couple of problems with that, one of which is I don't know 10,000 people. And also, it turns out £100,000 would not have been anything like enough money to make this film either. But lots of people did send me £10. And so I was kind of, from then on, I was making the film. Lots of people have asked me why I kind of carried on for such a long time. And Partly it's because I'm quite a sort of stubborn person. Partly it was because those people gave me £10 in 2006, and I was like, I said I was going to do it, so I was going to do it. So I went to I was freelancing in TV, so I was able to kind of control my hours to some extent. So I told the various, companies and bosses I was working with that I could only do 4 days a week then. And I spent that 5th day a week starting to learn about nuclear power. And the first thing I did was a lot of reading. This is a picture of the books that I read. It's a lot of books. And I also read like journal articles. There was a lot of briefings from various different kind of organisations on all sides of the debate around that time in the mid-late 2000s, because there was this discussion within government. And I watched kind of old documentaries and things, and I just kind of immersed myself in it. And then initially, I realised quite quickly that it was going to be quite difficult to just raise the money to make a big feature film. So I started thinking, well, maybe I'll make some short films. And I had this idea that I would do a kind of anthology. It was originally called 13 short films about atomic power. I didn't end up making 13, but I did make 7. And those were funded through a combination of little grants that I applied for, this crowdfunding, the proto crowdfunding, and self-funding. So the shorts that I made was the Yellow Monster is about uranium mining in the Navajo Nation in the United States. Legacy is a short documentary about decommissioning up at Dounreay. Minister was a film that I made with Tony Benn, and bits of that film, that's one of the few bits from the shorts that did end up in the main big film that you guys have just seen. That was Tony Benn reflecting back on his time in charge of the nuclear industry in the 60s, and then again when Labour came back in the 70s. Iranian Uranium is a little kind of comedy sort of animated song that was very much came out of, in a way we forget this now, I think, that there was a lot of concern at that time about Iran getting nuclear weapons. So that was kind of inspired by that. A Modest Proposal was a performance poetry film. You'll see from this, because I had no broadcaster, no commissioner, I had the freedom really to just do sort of what I wanted, and I tried out lots of different things. I have found it such an incredibly fascinating topic, nuclear, in all different kind of directions. And so I think these films show that I was just kind of following my nose and kind of, learning about all these different aspects that interested me. So that, and trying out different kinds of filmmaking as well. That was a performance poetry film. Beyond was another animation that was about nuclear waste. It was inspired by this work that had been done in America with sort of historians and philosophers and poets and artists about how best to sort of mark a nuclear waste site, so that potentially tens, thousands of years in the future, people would know that there was something that they should stay away from in this site. And then 50 Years is an experimental sort of photographic short film about safety incidents at Sellafield. So I've just got a few photos from some of those shorts. The top left there, that is a uranium tailings pile in Church Rock in New Mexico, where I filmed. Top right there, that's the poet down at Dungeness. Tony Benn there at the bottom, and then a very lovely image of Dounreay at the golden hour. Then these are, the top left there is the Iranian Uranium animated song. The middle one at the top is the Sellafield kind of experimental film, and then at the top there is the nuclear waste animation, and then at the bottom there's just a couple of, like, I thought you guys might see behind the scenes. That's me with Tony Benn. We filmed in his house, which was very interesting. And then at the bottom there, that's at Dounreay. So that was the kind of early years, but all the while I was making those short films, I was still reading and researching and learning a lot about this industry. And I had become very interested in the history, partly because when I was researching it, a lot of what there was to read was historical. Although it was back in the news at that time in the late 2000s, there wasn't sort of a huge amount of new stuff being written beyond the kind of like briefings from NGOs or professional bodies and things. So I was reading a lot of books from sort of the late 70s and early 80s, and I noticed that a lot of the discussions and talking points seemed to be very similar, even though we were all these years later on. So I got very interested in the history, and I'd also got very interested in the kind of messaging and the changing messaging. So I decided to ditch the anthology. I wanted to it was so interesting. I felt it was almost like a waste to just make all these little shorts. I should go all in and do something, one big film. So I got a very experienced executive producer on board. that's when we got more serious with raising the money. I got some money from Creative England. We sold shares in the film. I applied for loads more grants, did more crowdfunding. I worked on this film for free for years and years, and I put a lot of money on credit cards. In 2012, we had enough money that I was able to stop my work in TV, and I went full time to make this film. And that's when I did the big main bit of the shooting. So we filmed in 4 different countries, which is UK, US, France, Germany. I counted up, it was 16 cities and 32 different locations and 47 interviews, which is not all the interviews of the film because I did do some later, and obviously Tony Benn had come before, but 47 interviews in that main bulk of the filming. So here's a few, again, behind the scenes. At the top left there is Bradwell. These were the retired workers from who were at Bradwell in the early 60s. I wanted to include this picture at the bottom left because this was, if you remember the train set, the model trains from the very beginning of the film, this was extraordinary. This really gives you a sense. This model train set took up basically the entire of the front room of this guy's house. It was really extraordinary, amazing to see it. And then that's me chatting with Ralph Nader while my cameraman was putting some kind of blinds up, I think, in the background. These are the bit more sort of official government bits of filming I did. So that's William Magwood, who was at the NRC now. He's now at the OECD, the Nuclear Energy Association. He was, I mean, everybody I met was really kind and, you know, gave me loads of time and but I really liked Bill Magwood. He was a great, really nice guy. And then over on the right there, that's Jürgen Trittin, who was the German Environment Minister, and in the middle that's the sign outside of the Environment Ministry in Berlin. So I was going away, I was doing all this filming, but I was actually pregnant while I was doing the big bulk of that filming. And so in January, my son was born. But actually the film had to carry on because very shortly before I went on maternity leave, I had hired a French-speaking researcher, and we were trying to find Marcel Boiteau, the boss of EDF, and I wasn't sure if he would still be alive. A lot of the people, when I was researching the film, obviously I was looking back several decades, and I would find really fascinating people that I would thought, oh, I'd love to talk to them, and then I would find their obituary, and I wasn't sure if Boiteau would still be alive. He was I think he was 93 then. But extraordinary, this was very French. He still had an office at EDF despite being in his 90s, and a secretary. This researcher was able to get in touch with him, and he was happy to do an interview. But because he was of such a sort of very advanced years, I was really worried that he, you know, may not still be with us by the time I came back off of my maternity leave. So I sent a crew out. That's the one interview that I didn't personally do. I was at home with my 3-week-old baby while my crew went out to Paris, which was a kind of weird old day that was. Then later on in 2014, I hired a composer. All of the score in the film was specially composed for this film, and we also started editing. And again, I look back, I was extremely optimistic about how much kind of work I was going to be able to do after I'd had my baby. I thought that I would pretty much just be able to crack on, but that was not the case. I was, you know, very tired, very sort of brain frazzled, and the editing was not massively productive during that period, but we did start. So yeah, this is just me signing off. I had a newsletter for the film. This is me signing off before maternity leave, and this is from the edit. I thought you might be interested to see this. So this is a huge amount of material, obviously, in this film, sort of 70 odd years, 4 different countries. So we were kind of almost like editing it on the wall in these post-it notes. This was the sort of moving the structure around. So this was a little glimpse into the edit. And then, so 2015, 2016, we were carrying on with the editing. I was still only working part-time because I had a young baby and toddler. And I was also doing loads of archive research through this time. And this was also the moment, the Atom and Love Affair, the love affair concept actually came quite late. It came while we were editing, and it came out of really my sort of feelings from having done all of the interviews. And I really got more and more fascinated in the kind of psychology and the emotion involved on all sides. And we tried this sort of concept of it. I had this idea of the love affair. And when I tried to map it on to the events in the story, it seemed like it fitted quite well. I mean, there is definitely moments when I'm sort of, it's a bit tortuous, the metaphor, but I quite like that. I wanted the film to be kind of fun to watch and not just a sort of, you know, a lecture. So that love affair thing, that came in quite late. Also around this time, we got accreditation with the BFI to get the UK film tax credit relief. That was a big source of our funding. it was very hard to fund this film all the way through. I feel like I probably spent 90% of the time fundraising and only 10% of the time actually doing the film, which is one of the reasons why it took so long. We did a final push for crowdfunding around this time, and I also did a few more days, a few more interviews in France, Germany, and here in the UK. And then in 2016, we had a pretty decent rough cut, and we did a whole bunch of test screenings around the country to show the film to people to see if it made sense. It was a longer version. You know, what was interesting, what wasn't interesting, and that was really helpful to help to finesse it. Oh, this was the last ever day of filming. This is Bertrand Barret, who was the French engineer in Paris. Another guy, sadly, he's now passed away. I mean, it's a product of filming with lots of elderly people, but you know, it's kind of quite sad for me. Each time I come back and watch the film, more and more of my interviewees have passed away now. But this was a great day. And he was a really lovely man, really fascinating. And now we're nearly at the end. So, I mean, the film was really finished in 2017, more or less. But then we moved into the kind of final technical stuff. We recorded the score with live musicians, which was amazing. And we recorded the voiceover with Lily Cole. And then there was a lot of technical stuff that you need to do to get the film ready to be shown for broadcast or in cinemas. And then, yeah, it was finished. But then we just had this small hurdle of all of this commercial archive in the film, and it was about £60,000 worth. So we had to try and raise the money for that. Let's crack through. Oh, I think I missed a couple of pictures there. Sorry, I had some pictures from. How do I go back? There we go. Just on the left there, that's at the score record with the musicians, which was really exciting to do. And again, on the right, that's the voiceover record with Lily Cole. Some of you might recognise her. She's been in some movies. So yeah, then the end was really just more fundraising. I applied for various grants. We were unsuccessful with the main film funding in this country through the BFI, which is the lottery funding. We didn't get that. There was a period when it looked like Lush, the toiletries company, were going to help us finish the film and sponsor the release, but then some things changed internally and that didn't happen. So then we did a slightly unconventional thing. It's very common with feature documentaries like this to also have a shorter kind of TV version, because most broadcasters don't want to show a 90-minute documentary. That's usually done later after the film's sort of released. But in this case, we were advised to cut the TV version first, and we took out all of the love affair bits, which I kind of felt a bit sad about, but that was partly for time, and partly we were advised that it was very British. They said, oh, with that lovely British sense of humour, but they weren't sure that would necessarily kind of travel internationally. So I don't know, but we took that out. And the idea was that selling the broadcast version would help pay for the archive to clear it for the full cinema version. So I had this kind of horrendous about 3-week period in 2019 where I put 50-odd thousand pounds on my credit cards, which was just a very scary time. But fortunately, the sales agent did come through, and we made the first broadcast sales, pretty quickly. And then at the end of 2019, we finally had our festival premiere up in Leeds, which was wonderful. Cinema release was all booked in for spring in 2020. What could go wrong? Well, we all know what happened. We had a global pandemic, which was not. I mean, first world problems. I know my film was not was small beans in terms of what was going on, but it was kind of hard because we'd spent all of these years making this film, and it was all ready to get in the cinemas, and then all the cinemas closed down. Oh, and the other thing to say is I had also just had my second baby literally about 10 days before we went into lockdown, so that was also a slightly complicating factor. But fortunately, my distributors were amazing, and they very quickly were able to pivot, and the film was released digitally with Curzon Home Cinema. And then most of 2020 I was on maternity leave, but when I came back I started booking screenings like this one. They all obviously had to be virtual to start with because of the pandemic, but since then we've done loads and loads of screenings, all different really interesting groups, universities and schools, community groups, NGOs, with different government agencies, companies, and those were virtual to start with, but we've done a lot more physical ones in the last couple of years. And my sales agent did come through for me. She has sold that TV version, has been sold all over the world, and the feature version was sold to Netflix in Europe, which is very exciting. And then I just wanted to finish up really with sort of where we are now, because time time marches on, and it's already 4 years now since the film first came out, and I'm very conscious, and especially in the more recent Q&As that I've been doing, I think that the context around nuclear energy has changed quite a bit since the film came out back in 2020. There was a much more downbeat kind of feeling, and I think the end of my film feels more downbeat than I think the industry generally is feeling right now. There's much more of a mood of optimism. Some examples of that is the triple nuclear energy declaration that we had at the COP28, and also here in the UK, the civil nuclear roadmap that was published earlier this year, which is committing to a big I think it's the biggest expansion into nuclear since the early period back in the 60s. So yeah, there's lots of optimism, but sort of to temper that optimism, I guess, on the other hand, Hinkley C isn't operating it. I had a little kind of joke with myself while I was making the film that who was going to be finished first, my film or Hinkley? That both took a long time. But I did win that race. And Sizewell C, we're still waiting for the final investment decision on that. And SMRs is also interesting. So, it's a long time, really. I did most of those interviews, we talk about SMRs at the end of my film, but those interviews were done about a decade ago now. And it was still at that time quite a sort of conceptual technology for down the line. And it sort of feels like it's still there, really, mostly. And there's been some financial issues for some of the companies. Most recently, there was a NuScale. They had a big contract in the US, which has been cancelled. So, yeah, the story continues. I mean, it was always going to be the case with a film like this. It's a historical story, but obviously the events don't stop just because I finished the film. I always knew that would be the case. So things are rolling along, and there remains tons to talk about, both looking back to what has happened in the past, but obviously where we are now and where we're going to be going. So looking forward to getting stuck in with everybody. How do I now have to stop sharing my screen, right? Okay, I think I've stopped sharing. Yes, good.
Yeah, thanks, Vicky. That was really interesting. Really great to see the background of the film and where it all came from, and it definitely does sound like a real love affair, doesn't it? With not just the atom, but the film and the filmmaking process itself.
Yeah.
I'd just like to say that I watched it with my husband, who is Spanish.
Oh, yeah.
And we both really liked the little movie, the love affair movie clips in there. So I don't think it would be lost on an international audience.
I thought, I wanted to make sure we had that in there. I think it brings something to it, doesn't it? But
absolutely. Right, I'm going to go to the questions now. If you're ready.
I'm ready, yeah.
So firstly, what was the most challenging part about making the film, would you say?
Oh, 100% raising the money. I mean, it was just very, very difficult. It's quite interesting looking back from now, because when I was starting to make this film, my film is, it's talking heads and archive, and that was a very out of fashion style of filmmaking at the time when I was first doing it. And I got a lot of people telling me that I should make a film that was me. Vicky goes to investigate nuclear power, me going around places, and I wasn't very interested in that. I'm just like some random person that got interested in it. Like, I'm much more interested in hearing from, which is what I did. I tried to have this rule for myself from as soon as there were people who were still alive, that I was filming people who were actually there and part of it. They were working in the industry, or whether they were in government, or they were involved, or they were campaigners, or they were involved in the story, rather than me, who's just some outsider. But that was one of the reasons that made it hard to fund, I think. That has changed, I would say, more recently, because some of the the streamers have actually made. There have been some big series, but all kinds of different things that are basically interviews and archive. But definitely at the beginning that was hard. Also the international aspect, which was something that was important to me as I started researching it. It was very interesting and striking that there'd been, nuclear energy is a technology, and we know how it works. It is what it is. A nuclear power station in France or Germany or America or anywhere, it's basically the same technology, but it's had this very different trajectory in these different countries. So that was something that was important to me to include in the film, but that also made it harder. Ultimately, I think it made it easier once it was finished. It made it, it helped for my sales agent to sell it to different countries around the world. But in terms of actually getting it funded while we were making it, that was also difficult, because the Brits wanted it to be just about, Sellafield, say, or the Americans would want it to be just about America. So I kind of made it harder for myself, and it's full of archive, which is incredibly expensive. So I did make it hard for myself, but I don't know, I think it was worth it. I'm happy with the film that we got in the end, and I think the fact that it took a really long time as well, largely because of these funding issues, I think it's a much better film for the fact that it took a long time, because I had much longer to think about things and to not just to kind of go for the first obvious. Nuclear is, one of these topics that it's just got this very sort of polarizing debate around it, and films tend to be either for nuclear or anti-nuclear, and I'm sure that's maybe the obvious lens to go in at it, because that's how we tend to see it in media debates. But actually, I very quickly was kind of found that quite boring, and I was much more interested in just kind of looking at what has happened and not kind of trying to make an argument about something. And I think that is something that came out of the fact that it took a long time to make it. But yeah, funding the film was 100% the most challenging part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I definitely think it was worth it. We've got a comment from someone in the audience saying, "What a journey, well done for sticking with it." And also asking, did your personal view of nuclear energy change from start to finish? At the beginning, did you mention you were campaigning for Greenpeace? So did I hear that right? Oh.
Say again. Sorry, it's a bit jumpy. I can't hear you very well.
Did your personal view of nuclear energy change from start to finish?
Yeah, I would say. I mean, I'm not sure I had a view particularly at the beginning, but if I had been, I would have just probably said, "Oh, I don't think it's a good idea," or not even I didn't think it was a good idea, but I just didn't. I didn't really even know that it was kind of relevant anymore. Like I say, I don't even really know that I knew that it was still going on, and also I'm not sure. It's kind of hard for me to recall exactly what I knew and felt then, because I've layered on all these years subsequently of becoming completely obsessed with it. But I'm not sure that I completely could have drawn the clear distinction in my mind between civil nuclear power and nuclear weapons either at the beginning. And obviously nuclear weapons very scary, and I probably had a sort of that traditional sort of worried about nuclear. So yeah, I know so much more. My views are just much more complex and nuanced now. I'm still not really convinced that it's gonna be the way we get through climate change, just because it's economically so difficult. We're still fighting, they're still not really operating all these planned new power stations, but I much more understand why all the positives of the technology, and I really get in a way that I just didn't know about stuff, but I really understand why, especially in those early decades. I mean, it must have been incredible. It's probably hard for people of our generation to really appreciate, because we've never lived through that time. But I was talking to my grandparents, and when we used coal for everything, everywhere was just black. That when nuclear came along, it was just so clean, and the potential is wonderful. And that's what I guess partly what I found very sort of seductive in looking at it. It's a really compelling technology. We've struggled sometimes with the social and political sort of context to make it work, but as a sort of pure piece of technology and science, it's amazing. It is for someone like me who's a non-scientist. It's still, I do understand how it works, but it does feel a little bit kind of magical. It's fundamental, isn't it? Kind of building, literally the building blocks of the universe. It is very incredible technology.
I mean, you're preaching to the converted here, aren't you? Talking to the Society for Radiological Protection, but yes, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What struck me in the film was how easily they passed things in France in the 70s, and they built, what was it, 58 reactors. Do you think there are any lessons we can learn from the French sort of way of doing things?
Yeah, I had lots of waves of sort of oh, this is what the film's about. And there was certainly a period of time when I got it was sort of not that easy to really tease into it too much in the film, because I was trying to tell a story in the film, and this was more of I suppose a conceptual thing. But I got very interested in the kind of that democracy and the type of the form of government where where nuclear operates and what impact that has. And obviously France is democracy. I mean, they're having an election right now, just as we are. But I didn't know this. I mean, this is probably a reflection of our education system. We don't necessarily learn that much about other countries, maybe with the exception of America. But I was not aware until I started researching this film how much more kind of centralized and technocratic France is, and definitely was. I don't know if it's still so much now. But yeah, they were no planning inquiries. It's a completely state-run industry. And there was an amazing quote that I heard from several people, which I didn't end up putting in the film, but there was and it may be an apocryphal story, but I think it was an American nuclear executive who was over in France in the 70s, because, you know, at that same time, the French government was also similarly very committed to having a big expansion, but they were not able to do it in the same way that France was. And obviously that was something I was trying to tease out why that was. And this American executive was like, how are you doing this? How are you managing to just get them all through? We know we're getting mired up in licensing hearings and, you know, fundraising, because they just had so many different companies and different designs and all the rest of it. And apparently this French nuclear executive, and I won't try and do too much the sort of cod French accent, although sometimes when I've had this story told to me that people do that, they said, when you want to drain the swamp, you do not ask the frog. And they just said, you know, basically we just decide, like, government decides to do it and then we do it, like and that I touched on it a bit, you know, the state, the people and the state are considered to be that the state is representing the people, so that they don't have those hearings. So yeah, and I suppose if you look to now, the country that is most successfully building a greater number of reactors is China, who again, you know, there's no licensing hearings in China for new reactors. So I don't know, it's an interesting, I'm not sure that we want to say let's just have no hearings, but I don't know, this is one of the factors I think about how that's been maybe one of the difficulties, because they're big planning entities. A nuclear power station is a very big, well, even I mean, they weren't so big at the beginning. I guess in the 70s they're much bigger now. Yeah, it's a conundrum, and I don't know what the answer is, but yeah, I think that's the thing, that the difference in the planning and the consultation kind of approach in those different countries.
Thank you. Yes. Did you encounter much opposition when you were asking for interviews? What was the reaction to your requests in different countries, for example?
Sorry, I've not got a very good. Just say that again. Did
you encounter much opposition when you were asking people for interviews, and between different countries, did you find different reactions?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a question I've had a lot. Like, how did I get these people to talk to me? I mean, there was no sort of special source. I just emailed people and said I was making this film. I mean, I don't know. I wonder whether the fact that I was just an independent. I mean, I work in TV, so I was not a complete sort of, you know, it was not completely random, but I was not emailing like I would in my TV job saying I'm making this program for BBC Two or Channel 4 or whatever. You know, I was an independent filmmaker. I don't know if that made it easier or for people to say yes, but generally everybody that I contacted was very happy to speak to me. I mean, I didn't end up. I probably over filmed really, because the people were so interesting. There was a number of interviews that didn't make it into the film, mainly where I just had they were kind of doubling up a bit, you know, and I just couldn't. You know, the first edit of the film was like 4.5 hours long, and I had to be really brutal in leaving things out. But no, generally, I just contacted people, and people were. I mean, I did very lengthy phone interviews with everybody, apart from Marcel Boiteau, the French guy, which for those particular circumstances. But generally, I had a long chat, you know, sort of almost like a pre-interview over the phone, so they knew what we were going to be talking about ahead of time. I sent them the questions, you know. So no, I didn't really get pushback, luckily.
Did you? So when you spoke to the people, for example, when you were speaking to the Bradwell workers,
yeah,
and they were so proud, and that really came across in the interviews. Did you speak to anybody that's sort of currently in the nuclear industry? And do you think there's a difference? Do you think they were more proud because it was like a pioneering thing? Or?
I mean, I did not when I was making the film. I'm trying to think if I did. Not really, because. No, I mean, because I was looking back at historical, I did think about trying to speak to a current energy minister in the UK, and I'm pleased that I didn't, because they changed so often that I think it would have dated it. Because I was mainly looking back at the history, I guess I didn't speak to people in the nuclear industry when I was making the film. I have done much more, obviously, since the film has been out. Yeah, I would say I've still encountered a similar kind of pride, but I think there probably was something quite particular in that. I think it was a different time as well. You know, that post-war era in general. You know, technology kind of means something different in a way. I think now when we say technology, the first place our brains go to is, you know, the internet and sort of cyber stuff. I mean, I don't know, but I think definitely in that post-war era, things like, you know, the space race, the nuclear age, that's kind of what people maybe meant when they thought of technology, and those things were having like a really massive impact. And it was just a time when, you know, I fell down some amazing, glorious rabbit holes with the archive research, you know, seeing all the films from that era. There was a real kind of reverence for science that I don't know is quite there in the same way now. There's probably all kinds of reasons for that, but, you know, if you look at, you know, it talking about the pandemic, there was much more sort of maybe questioning of, you know, there's been a, you know, sort of conspiracy theories and things. There's, you know, a lot more questioning of expertise perhaps than there was in the 50s and 60s. So maybe that helped with the pride. Also, I think certainly speaking to the guys at Bradwell and also speaking to people at Dounreay, that didn't end up in the feature film, but generally these power stations were built in relatively small communities. So lots of people worked at those power stations, but also there was a kind of pride that it's come to our town, you know, that we're getting to, you know, be the sort of standard bearers for this like exciting new development in science, and it's where we live. You know, I think there was a kind of pride about that. That was my sense. I mean, I love those Bradwell guys, and I cut much there was so much more, you know, I had that with everybody, but I mean there was a much longer version, you know, in earlier iterations of the film, earlier edit. Yeah, I was struck by that. I wasn't really expecting it. I wasn't really expecting so much the sort of community stuff. I think that's the other thing that's really changed. You know, the Central Electricity Generating Board obviously is long since gone, but they felt, I think, not just part of this kind of national endeavour with nuclear, but they were literally they all worked for this one big company, and they were a family, you know, and that family really looked after them. And I feel like we don't kind of live in that world anymore of these, maybe the NHS, I suppose, possibly the BBC. There are a few of these sort of still very large state-owned kind of, you know, companies and institutions, but it did feel like kind of talking about us like a bygone era to me, really. And they were really, they just painted a wonderful picture of that time, I think.
Thank you. I would, just as an aside, I would love a copy of your reading list, that stack of books, to have a look through your reading list.
Oh yeah, well yes, I can send that to you. Yeah, we've got it hasn't, and we've found it struggle to kind of get this out, but I got a little bit of financial support from the British Society for the History of Science, funded like a schools guide, a study and discussion guide. It's just been quite difficult to reach schools with it, so we haven't unfortunately done as many screenings with it as I would like, but that has a full reading list in it, so yeah, I can definitely share that with you.
Brilliant, thank you. Possibly
most of those books are quite old, quite a lot of them are out of print, but
possibly a slightly controversial one now. What are your thoughts about China possibly dominating and controlling the nuclear program in the future?
Well, I don't think it's a thrilling prospect, probably. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's just so much. It's opaque, isn't it? We don't really know that much about what's going on. You know, their work, their safety for their workers, and I mean, I feel like a little bit I'm talking beyond my any kind. Well, I don't have any expertise, but you know, beyond my research. But I mean, I know for sure that the UK government has had enough disquiet about China that China's no longer part of. You know, there was a period of time, wasn't it, when China was going to be involved in the new generation here, and that's no longer the case, as far as I am aware. Yeah, I think it would be concerning, I guess. It's major national infrastructure, isn't it? And do we want to be kind of letting China in, you know, potentially in through that door? Probably not. But I kind of some of these questions, I always feel like I'm I get sort of imposter syndrome. You know, I'm basically just like an English graduate that got like really interested in nuclear, but I'm not a political expert or a scientific expert at all. But yeah, I don't think I'd be thrilled about China dominating.
Brilliant, thank you. Did the film turn out as you expected?
Well, I suppose it's hard to know. It changed massively along the way. Like I say, the love affair part was a very late addition. I think it probably did. I mean, I'm really happy with it. Obviously, I've watched it so many times. You see little tiny bits where you're like, oh, I should have cut a little bit sooner there or something, or little tiny tweaks. I suppose the one thing I would say is that in my most ideal world, I would have been able to make something much longer. Like if somebody would have been willing to pay for like the 3-part series, I'd have loved to do that, and I certainly had the material to do that, but nobody was willing to fund that. And in some ways, it's always a balance, isn't it? Maybe if I had have made the 3-part series, not as many people would have watched it, because that's a bigger commitment to sit down and watch 3 hours about the history of nuclear. And maybe one thing that you can sit down. I wanted it to be to try and reach an audience that was not just people who already were really interested in nuclear, and that has been the case. And I've definitely had, especially through some of the not doing too many, but the cinema screenings that we've done, people who have said to me, like, I didn't really know, like me really, like I didn't really know that much about it, and I've learned loads. That's really gratifying to me, because for me, well, I don't know, I'm aware I'm preaching to a very much a sort of converted audience here, but I just think it's a really fascinating sort of lens through which to look at all kinds of things. I remain really interested in it, despite the fact that it's 18 years since I first had that thought that I would make this film about nuclear. I still think it's really, really fascinating. It tells us lots about all kinds of things, and I don't really know why other people aren't as interested in it as I am, but yeah, I think I'm broadly happy with how it is.
So would you be planning on updating the film, or maybe making a sequel? Or have you had enough?
It's not that I've had enough. It's just that I can't financially do it. I mean, their eyes would water if they saw how much debt I've still got from it. I mean, possibly if some magic wand was to appear and somebody would kind of fully fund me to do it, but also I don't know. I mean, I think the existing film like works as it is, I think, because it is that grand scope through the decades. So in some ways, if I was to update it, that feels slightly pointless, in the sense that it's, whenever I updated it at till, it's still just going to then become events will overtake it again. That's just always going to happen. A full sequel, I don't know. I mean, I'm looking at doing other things I've met some, it's been one of the things that's been amazing, like for me, with taking the film out to all the screenings, is just I've met so many like really amazing people. And actually I should do a plug. I've started a blog. Maybe you guys, I don't know if you guys might be able to share the thing, but it's on Substack, and I'm planning to use that as a space part, like in a much cheaper way, to just do writing rather than making films, to share some of the research from the past that I came across that I was not able to include in the film, but also other things I'm interested in. And there are various kind of opportunities that I've made it known, like I would like to do more filmmaking around broader nuclear issues. I'm actually going tomorrow, very excitingly, there's an open day at Harwell, and Harwell are in the process of hopefully setting up a kind of heritage, sort of interactive heritage centre. I mean, they're not only, Harwell is not only nuclear now, it's a broader sort of scientific park, but because I kind of befriended Sellafield, now have a heritage lead who wasn't there when I was making the film, which is a shame. It would have been a great help for me probably if he was there. But yeah, he's kind of introduced me to the guys at Harwell, so it might be that there's something I can do for that as part of that. I'm talking to the nuclear waste services, that there might be something we can do around a sort of filmmaking project with the communities, Cumbria and Lincolnshire, who are the potential host communities for the UK's nuclear waste. So I think I'm not done with broader nuclear as a topic. Nuclear like the specific nuclear energy story that I've told in this film, I think probably I've done that. Like I spent, 15 years or something on that. I think I'd feel like I was just retreading old ground if I just went in and kind of updated it, or even just did a kind of follow on. But I would be interested if someone else will kind of do that. But yeah, I don't think there's going to be a specific sequel, is the answer.
Well, there's some comments in the chat, and I think there'd definitely be an audience from the people on today anyway, at least, if you did make any other films. Let me just see if we've got any more questions. One comment, my memory of the German anti-nuclear campaign is that it seemed to go global. Any insight into why that happened?
Well, I think we can't follow back, can we? I guess you mean in terms of the coverage of it going global. I'm assuming. Well, I don't know whether it was just the scale. I mean, one of the things, like I was saying, I had to leave so much out. There were huge anti-nuclear protests in France as well, and we did have that in the film for quite a long time. Actually, Marcel Boiteau, this was, they talk about you have to kill your babies when you're making films. You have to make some tough choices about what to leave in and what to leave out. And I really was reluctant to leave this out, but his apartment in Paris was actually bombed while he was at home in the late 70s by some anti-nuclear, extremists, and he was at home with his wife and his teenage daughter when this happened. And I didn't think he would probably be willing to talk about it, but I put a question on for the crew that I sent out there, and he did talk about it, and it was really, it was extraordinary. And there were some huge protests in France around that time, as well as in Germany. And equally in Germany, there was before early days, there is a German nuclear industry. There was a lot of enthusiasm, huge enthusiasm for nuclear power in Germany. And in the end, we had, for time or for clarity, we had to make this decision that for the purposes of the storytelling for my film, France became, the pro-nuclear country. Germany became the anti-nuclear country. But that's a huge simplification, obviously. And yeah, there was very big process in France as well. Lots of people have asked me why that. Well, often people have asked me why we didn't have similar scale of protests here as they did on the continent in that period of time. And I don't really know what the answer is. I don't know if there's something cultural, or maybe the way that the Brits, protest, or is different, is more. I don't know really. I suppose in terms of the mass impact, you're talking about a lot of numbers of people, so maybe that's what it is. I don't know really. I'd be speculating. I'd love to, I know we can't talk back, but it'd be interesting to hear what other people thought about why that might be. I mean, I don't remember it. I was only born at that. I was a baby at the time, so I'm not speaking from first-hand memories.
Going back to the film, the discussion about the turnkey reactors in America.
Yeah,
I couldn't help but make a bit of a comparison with SMRs. The whole relatively cheap, all you need to do is plug it in. Do you worry that maybe SMRs are going to go the same way that the turnkey reactors went?
Well, I mean, the early signs aren't particularly great, are they, in terms of NuScale? That was the similar thing. I mean, I suppose it's really difficult because these are, as yet, sort of uncommercialized technologies, and obviously, especially, it'll be interesting. Well, I don't know. I'm trying to think if in the UK, I think in the UK they're tendered, aren't they? Because I mean, I wondered if it would, there's a difference. One of the issues for the US was that it was always an entirely like corporate commercial, but they never had a state-owned nuclear industry like we did. We moved, we started state-owned and moved away, but the US, it was always companies, and obviously in any individual corporation, it's in their interests they're trying to win the tender. I mean, I guess maybe a sort of equivalent might be, the train operating companies who, they're tendering. They're obviously going to be as optimistic as possible in their estimates for how much things are going to cost, because they want to win the tender. And also, maybe, this is one of the issues as well with all big, we see it not just in nuclear, obviously all kinds of big infrastructure projects, just things happen that you're not anticipating. And then things cost a lot more and take a lot longer than you thought. I guess I would say I probably would worry about that with SMRs, unless you had something similar to what happened, say, in France in the 70s, or maybe what's happening in China now, where you just, I mean, we will see if this might be what it would take. I went to a really interesting webinar a couple of weeks ago at the Dalton Nuclear Institute at Manchester, which is actually, it's online. People could go and watch it. It was really interesting. I think, and the headline, the title was something like, "Is nuclear power the answer to net zero?" or something like that. But the discussion was kind of like, what would we need, or what would need to happen for nuclear to play a big role for net zero? And so that was some of the discussion about whether actually you really need to have governments who will just completely, because governments are probably the only sort of actors that have enough resources behind them to, you know, to fully commit, to just back them to get them up and running. But if it's left to commercial companies, again, I mean, I'm always wary of, like, I'm not an expert, but from what I can read and understand, I think it's tricky for companies to gauge the costs in these are first generation of things. They've not been built before. There will be almost certainly unanticipated things that come up that cost more than you thought, you know.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks, Vicky. I think we've got time for one last question, and that is, how and when can others watch the film? I think people are quite keen to get others to watch it as well.
So yeah, so it's on in the UK. It's on Netflix if you've got a Netflix account. Otherwise, it's just on Vimeo on demand. We've not put it on like iTunes and Google Play and places like this because it's actually kind of financially disastrous. It costs so much money to get the films into a like a state that they will take, that it would actually cost us money to put it on there, you know. So my distributors have decided not to do that. We had problems with Netflix, but because the film's got 3 different languages in it, we've had some real issues. Netflix really struggled, and in the end, even now, to watch it on Netflix, you have to have the captions on to see the subtitles. For the first about year it was on there, and they had just put a version up where you couldn't see, it was a textless version, so it had none of the contributor names and who they were on there. That has been resolved now, but yeah, that's a caution. You do need to have the captions on. Otherwise, yeah, it's on Vimeo on demand for you know, to pay per stream kind of thing. And I can send you guys the links to both of those.
Fabulous. Thank you, Vicky. I think that's all we've got time for today, but thank you for a really, really informative discussion on your film and the journey that you've gone through to get here. And I think we'll all agree that we're really glad that you made it in the end, because we've all enjoyed the film very much. Thank you very much.